Hello, I would like to talk you through the last chapter of Foucault's book, The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, which is actually called in French La Volonté de Savoir, the Will to Know, originally published in 1976, and extremely interesting. Not the easiest of reading, as you possibly noticed. It is actually rather dense, which partly has to do with the fact that Foucault wraps up the argument of the entire book, so it would probably help to read the entire book and not just the last chapter. That would make it much easier, of course, because it is sort of drawing together the entire the argument of the entire book. But on the other hand, it is being very condensed. It contains many concepts that Foucault develops, not just in this book actually, but also in earlier books. So for study purposes, it's quite a handy piece, although it is difficult to read. But it's if you manage your way through that, you get quite a good impression of what Foucault is about, because many of the key ideas are Foucault brings many of his key ideas into this particular chapter. It is roughly in 3 sections, actually 4 sections, but the 4th section is only the last 2-3 pages, which is sort of not really a section in its own right. So I treat it as being in 3 parts. An introduction where he introduces his concept of power, basically, and that is of course what Foucault is famous for. So that is the one thing everybody knows about Foucault, that his theory is chiefly about power. And on the first 10 pages of this chapter he introduces the concepts of sovereignty, power, discipline, and interestingly, which perhaps you didn't expect, he relates the particular shift that he's discussing, which is basically from the 18th to the 19th century, to the development of capitalism, in particular industrial capitalism, which is of course what is in terms of social history the crucial shift that takes place in that period of time that Foucault is looking at, which he refers to as modernity. So for Foucault, modernity is basically the 19th century onwards, and he does relate the things he's talking about in the first section of this chapter to the transformation, or the societal transformation that is the emergence of industrial capitalism. And then he talks in that context. So he first sets out on the first 10 pages these concepts of sovereignty, power, and discipline in relation to their context in the period from the 18th to the 19th century, in the period of the transition from the 18th to the 19th century. And then he relates that to the concepts of sex and sexuality, and this is of course where the main argument really takes place. So the basic idea is that he thinks the concept of sex is in modernity, in our period of history, treated as if it was some kind of a secret, that it is hugely important to decipher and uncover. And he actually makes fun on the last pages of our period's obsession with disclosing the secrets of sex. And he ends up basically saying that there are much more interesting things to study and to look at and to talk and to think about than sex. That's basically how the book concludes. So let's begin with the beginning, with the shift from one concept of power, which he refers to as the classical one, to the modern one. So he says, for a long time, one of the characteristic privileges of sovereign power, the power of a sovereign, was the right to decide life and death. He says that this derives from the ancient, in this case he's referring to classical Rome, to the ancient concept of patria potestas. Potestas means power. It's in fact etymologically the same word. Patria means belonging to the father, or fatherly perhaps. So patria potestas is the fatherly power, or the power of the father of the family, namely of a Roman family, and that power he relates consisted in the right to dispose of the life of children and slaves, because the father of the family basically in that society, in that conception of family and society, owns the children and the slaves. So that is absolute sovereign power over the life of his dependents. So he had given them life, so he could take life away. That is the kind of really crude, classic, ancient conception of sovereign power. By the time the right of life and death was framed by the classical theoreticians, Foucault usually means those of the early modern period, so like 17th, 18th century. In this case he refers in particular to Pufendorf, one of the key political theorists of that period, of the 17th century. So by the time this right, or this concept of sovereignty was framed, framed means basically theorized, written up in political theory, it was in a considerably diminished form. So by that time in the 17th century we don't have this crude patriarchal sovereignty, but we have a somewhat more modulated form of that concept of sovereignty. It was no longer considered that this power of the sovereign was absolute, but it came with certain conditions. And these conditions were that the sovereign, which then obviously refers to the sovereign of a state, the ruler of a state, had the right to kill his subjects, basically either in the context of war, or when this sovereign himself was somehow threatened by his subject. So in a sense, Foucault says this power was at that point sort of indirect, so it was not quite the crude power that it had been in antiquity. So as a kind of punishment. So the power of life and death was in the early modern context, when this was sort of theorized properly for the first time, not an absolute privilege, but it was conditioned by the defense of the sovereign and his own survival. And he now basically proposes two sort of alternative theorizations of sovereign power in the 17th century. One by Thomas Hobbes, who sees the power of the sovereign, the prince, the king, as rooted in the transfer to the prince of the natural right possessed by every individual to defend his life. So you remember in Hobbes' conception, we all have this natural right to defend ourselves, but we come together in this sort of social contract, which is obviously only a sort of a thought play. We come together and transfer this right to the sovereign, and now the sovereign has this right because he has acquired this from us, basically, in the form of this imaginary contract. Alternatively, he refers to Pufendorf, whom I just mentioned, another, or probably the other, apart from Hobbes, the other early modern political theorist, who thinks of this power of the sovereign as a special right that is not transferred from the individuals, but that comes sort of automatically, sort of spontaneously about through the formation of a state or a society. So there's a slight variation there, but basically these are the two early modern theorizations of sovereign power. In any case, Foucault writes, whether it's relative or in or not, the right of life and death is a dissymmetrical one. The sovereign exercises his right of life only by exercising his right to kill, or by refraining from killing. He evidenced his power over life only through the death he was capable of requiring. The right which was formulated as the power of life and death was in reality the right to take life or to let live. So it was what he says by dissymmetrical, so it was kind of not quite symmetrical. What he means by that is that it was much more about death than it was about life. It was about life only insofar as the sovereign could decide not to kill you. This is basically, in a sense, that is the limit of his power, which is much more about killing people, which is why the sword is the symbol of this kind of, if you like, pre-modern or pre-modern form of sovereign power. He goes on to describe this. He goes on to say that in the context he's talking about, the general context consists in a right of the sovereign basically to take away things from others. He calls that a right to making deductions. The word he's using, prélèvement, is related to the English word levy. So basically a deduction means you're taking like a levy or a tax. Basically you have, as the sovereign, you have the right to take away something from what the members of your society or your state have. So you appropriate a portion of the wealth produced by society in the form of taxes, for example, and levies and so on. So power in this instance, so in the pre-modern form of power, is essentially a right to take stuff away from others. Now, after he has set out how sovereign power worked before the modern context, he now shifts and says, since the classical age, the West has undergone a very profound transformation of these mechanisms of power. By the classical age, he seems to mean the 17th or 18th century, so the early modernity, which is sort of a transitional period in the way Foucault talks about it, from the pre-modern or the ancient way of organizing power in society to the modern way, which is essentially that of the 19th and of the 19th century and subsequently. So the profound transformation is that deduction has tended to be no longer the major form of power, but merely one element amongst others. So obviously there's still plenty of deductions, taxes and all that, but it is not anymore the main principal activity of the state. But rather it is working to incite, reinforce, control, monitor, optimize and organize the forces under that power. So it is a power that is bent on generating forces. So a power that produces power, basically. That is the basic idea Foucault's proposing here as being a characteristic of modernity. So that's what Foucault is talking about. So he's trying to describe key aspects of modernity. That could be, you could call that the sort of general rubric under which this entire text is formulated. So the modern function of power is to produce more power, not just to take away from the wealth produced by the powers of society as they exist, but rather to reshape and to expand them, to expand the power, the productive forces of society. That's the basic idea here. And there has been a parallel shift in the right of death, or at least a tendency to align itself with the exigencies of a life-administering power, and to define itself accordingly. So sovereign power now becomes a power of administering life, rather than a power that has the right to take away life. And you can sort of already guessing in what direction this is going. If your primary task or goal is, as the sovereign, the sovereign state or the ruler, to expand life and the life forces that produce wealth, then obviously it's not a very good idea to kill lots of people, because that will diminish the power over which you have sovereignty, right? So that is very in a very simplified manner, that would be the basic idea here. That's what the change really is. However, and this is now a really interesting observation, wars were never as bloody as they have been since the 19th century. If you think of the First and Second World War. Never before did regimes visit such holocausts on their own population. And I think when he says holocausts in the plural, he does think, first of all, of the Holocaust, that the genocide of European Jews that we usually call the Holocaust, but he also uses the word in a generic sense, referring to, I guess, genocides in general, and also other things that he mentions a few more further down in the text. So the extremely brutal and violent and murderous events of modern history. So basically from the last third of the 19th century onwards, all the way into the present, basically. So the paradox here is that this new type of power that manages life at the same time produces the most bloody massacres human history has ever seen. But this formidable power of death now presents itself as the counterpart of a power that exerts a positive influence on life, that endeavors to administer, optimize and multiply life, subjecting it to regulations. So regulating and managing power. And the idea here is, and I think Foucault is here talking about something very similar to the concept of a dialectic of enlightenment, or a dialectic of progress. So the same power that at least claims to be this positive sort of managing and sort of expanding power is at the same time the same power, obviously, that organizes these holocausts and brutal wars, etc., etc. That is the paradoxical characteristic of modernity that Foucault is getting at, and that he tries to illuminate through these conceptions that he is proposing here. Entire populations are mobilized for the purpose of wholesale slaughter in the name of life necessity. That is an important shift. So in the pre-modern period, or in the early modern period still, wars are conducted basically to expand the realm of the ruler and so on. Whereas now, if you think of the last two world wars, wars are conducted in the name of securing the survival and the welfare of society. So it seems that these incredibly bloody events have to be organized, that's what the sovereign power seems to suggest, in order to maintain and to warrant and to secure the existence of life itself. That is sort of the paradox that Foucault is talking about. Here he refers the atomic situation. I think he means obviously the nuclear bomb, and the situation in the Cold War is not the end point of this process. The power to expose a whole population to death is the underside of the power to guarantee an individual's continued existence. So this is the paradox from which Foucault starts out in this general introduction, where he develops his concept of sovereign power. So the existence in question is no longer the juridical existence of the sovereignty, so just the state as such, but it is basically society and the actual existence of the population itself. So if genocide is indeed the dream of modern powers, this is not because of a recent return to the ancient right to kill. It is because power is situated and exercised at the level of life, the species, the race, and the large-scale phenomena of population. So he's basically rejecting, implicitly here, a possible interpretation of genocide or of the Holocaust, if you want to relate it specifically to that the Holocaust or genocides in general are somehow falling back into those terrible times of the Middle Ages, that kind of argument, which you hear sometimes being made. So Foucault insists on the modernity of these events, and says the fact that they are so extremely bloody is not because they kind of revert to the old form of sovereignty, which is the right to kill, but they are so bloody because in the modern form of sovereign power, which defines itself much more as a power over life and about the organizing and regulating of life, these wars and massacres and genocides are claimed to have a particular function to play, and that's why they are done. That's why they happen. Now, in the next paragraph, he shifts to a different to a different aspect, if you like, a different example, with the use of which he tries to illustrate his conception here, namely that of the death penalty. So he writes that as soon as power gave itself the function of administering life, as opposed to just killing or not killing life, its reason for being and the logic of its exercise made it more and more difficult to apply the death penalty. So basically he's saying in modernity the death penalty gradually disappears, except in a relatively small number of countries. So in most of the modernizing countries, the death penalty basically comes out of use, and he says this is not because of the awakening of humanitarian feelings. It is rather because it doesn't fit into the logic of a modern sovereign power, a modern state, which is about expanding life and regulating life, and is not about killing life. So in a sense the death penalty is, he calls it a scandal. So it's kind of the limit point of modern power, because once you have killed somebody you cannot regulate them anymore. That's the downside of killing people. So you cannot exploit them, you cannot manage, you cannot regulate them anymore. So the death penalty is in that sense sort of the limit point of modern sovereign power. So capital punishment could not be maintained except for absolutely enormous crimes that allow to portray the criminal as a particularly monstrous person that is incorrigible. And in those circumstances the death penalty still can be applied in some countries at least, but that is on a much reduced scale compared to the 17th and 18th century. That is the argument he's making here, illustrating this shift in the nature of power and sovereignty. So the ancient right to take life or let live was replaced by a power to foster life or to disallow life to the point of death. So death is evaded in this new form of power. Foucault then goes on to a third example, which is the discussion of suicide. Obviously, in suicide in the past had been a crime, and he's basically suggesting that the reason that it was a crime was that it is basically when you kill yourself in this. In the old type, under the old type of sovereign power, you're basically cheating the ruler, because your life, like in the context of the ancient Roman father of the family, your life belongs to the sovereign. So if you kill yourself, you're basically destroying property of the sovereign. So that was obviously forbidden. In the modern context, it is not anymore forbidden. But rather it becomes a phenomenon that moderns have come to research with particular keen interest. And as you know, obviously, he's thinking obviously of Durkheim's book on suicide and others. So Durkheim's was not the only one. In the 19th century, suicide becomes one of the first key objects of study for sociology. So the determination to die was one of the first astonishments of a society in which political power had assigned itself the task of administering life. So this is so you see he kind of lists basically different cases or kind of examples of shifts, examples of shifts in the meaning of certain concepts and events that take place in social life. Now, next step of the argument is this. In concrete terms, he says, starting in the 17th century, so this is when this modernizing process begins, this power over life evolved in two basic forms, which are not antithetical, so they're kind of working together. And these are basically the disciplining and regulating. So the first one is centered on the body as a machine that needs to be disciplined to increase its usefulness and its docility, to make bodies docile, to make them do what we want them to do, the individual bodies, and to integrate them into disciplinary systems. This is what he calls the anatomopolitics of the human body. So anatomo, I guess that means politics of the anatomy. Basically, it's almost like he's saying bodybuilding, basically. So the way power in the form of discipline builds the modern human body, which is of course the body that can live and function in modern society. Like if you work in a factory, you need a different kind of body than when you're working as a peasant in your field. So it's a different anatomy that you need for that. So you need to be disciplined in a particular way to behave appropriately to the new sort of environment. Now the second strategy is focused not on the individual body but on the species body, which basically means in reality society, and has to do with propagation, with birth and mortality, with health, life expectancy and longevity. This strategy consists in regulatory controls, and this he calls the biopolitics of the population. So the state basically develops politics, this is what he calls biopolitics, that regulate the entire population in its sort of bodiliness, with all kinds of things to do with birth, health and death. They're all regulated by the state. So you have these two principal disciplines he's describing, and these are the major parameters Foucault uses to describe modern society: discipline and regulation. The anatomic and the biological, that's the words he's using here. Individualizing and specifying. So individualizing means to build up the individual bodies and make them better individually, also obviously in competition to others. And by specifying, I think he means creating a species, so a kind of like a population as a whole that is shaped through the regulatory regimes that are directed at this population. And this results in the administration of bodies, the management of life. This takes place in various disciplines that are developed in particular institutions, universities, schools, barracks, workshops, etc. And stretches to a variety of fields of disciplining and regulating birth rate, longevity, public health, obviously, housing, migration, so the state regulates through borders, etc., etc., who can go where and not, and so on, all these things. So he talks about an explosion of numerous techniques that are aimed to subjugate bodies and to control populations. And this is what he calls biopower. And now here is quite a bit of name dropping going on. These are all the names that I mentioned here play roles or are discussed in more details in earlier books by Foucault. So I have here some details on some of them. He talks about the army and schools as the institutions in which discipline takes place. He points out that this begins, or the kind of the discourses connected to this begin with military analyses. He mentions a guy called Maurice of Saxony, that was a 18th century general, a military man who wrote a very famous or important treatise on the art of warfare in the 18th century called Mes Rêveries, My Dreamings, which strikes me as a rather strange title for a book on warfare, but that's what it's called. He mentions this guy, then he mentions Guibert, who was an 18th century military theorist who advocated national conscript armies. That is obviously a huge step change in the building of the institutions of discipline that he describes. Conscript armies, very different from a mercenary army of professionals. Then he mentions a guy called Servan, who was also an 18th century theorist, but of criminal justice, so different kind of institution, but he lumps them all together because they all have in common a certain tendency, and these are all men of the Enlightenment, obviously, 18th century classics, who are all engaged in developing, rationalizing discourses in all these different fields. Then he mentions population control and demography. So he mentions Quesnay, who was an economist, again 18th century, perhaps the first author who produced a properly analytical work of political economy, so one of the pioneers of modern political economy. He mentions a guy called Moreau, Jean-Baptiste Moreau, and another person, Johann Peter Süßmich. They were pioneers, again, from the 18th century of demography. So he mentions all these people, he just throws these names in there because he assumes that we know them because we have read all of Foucault's other books, which maybe we haven't. He mentions the philosophy of the ideologists, les idéologues. That was a school of philosophers in the late 18th century, many of them connected then with the French Revolution, who are basically developing a modern philosophy of of how we know things, basically. So literally, ideology obviously means the science of ideas, right? So these philosophers were concerned with how we know anything at all, how we have ideas and how ideas are related to reality, and how you can govern reality through concepts. That was one of the big ideas in that period of time, known as the school of les idéologues. So he mentions all these. They're all part of this overall discourse that is emerging in particular in the second half of the 18th century, leading towards the 19th, obviously, which is where the proper modernization process takes place. He talks about the formation of the social body, etc., etc., and in this context, what he calls the deployment of sexuality will be situated, and this is what he will discuss in the middle section in particular of the chapter. And now comes the paragraph where he relates all these things to the emergence of modern industrial capitalism. So he says this biopower was related to the development of capitalism. The latter, capitalism, would not have been possible without the controlled insertion of bodies into the machinery of production. That's a very droll formulation, but it is sort of quite suggestive. So obviously what happens in industrial capitalism is you put bodies into machines. So it's almost a little bit, I don't know, but maybe Donna Haraway had her inspiration from this passage. I don't know, this idea of the cyborg. She uses a very similar formulation. You know, the feminist from the 1980s. So basically, about a decade after this, she writes this. So I have a strong sense this comes from here. So it's a very striking formulation. Bodies into the machines and the adjustment of the phenomena of population to economic processes. So he's basically saying that the modern state, in the period of industrial capitalism emergence, has to adapt the population to the needs of production, basically, of economic processes. But this was not all it required. It also needed the growth of both these factors, their reinforcement as well as their availability and docility. It had to have methods of power capable of optimizing forces, aptitudes and life in general, without at the same time making them more difficult to govern. So that's an important caveat. If you and this is something obviously that I'm thinking here of the fact that if populations become more trained in order to function within modern scientific production, that requires obviously education, that requires people to learn how to use complicated and expensive machines and so on. The workers have to understand more about science, so they have to become more enlightened, which is dangerous. So you don't want to train people as the sovereign ruler. You don't want to train people up to such an extent that they become too clever and maybe become unruly. So that is the problem here. So you have to do this disciplining thing, the training up thing, in such a way that it doesn't get out of hand and becomes actually dangerous. So if the development of the institutions ensured the maintenance of production relations, the rudiments of the anatomo and biopolitics, so the disciplining and the regulating, created as techniques of powers, operated through segregation and hierarchization. So these are the mechanisms that are introduced then to sort of safeguard the whole modernizing operation. So the adjustment of the accumulation of men to the accumulation of capital, the joining of the growth of human groups to the expansion of productive forces, were made possible in part by the exercise of biopower in its many forms and modes of application. So this has to be balanced out with each other, all these different processes. So they are not monolithic, so they're going into different directions at the same time. The next paragraph begins with a sort of aside on Max Weber. So he says, we have been hearing so much about the ascetic morality that was supposedly so terribly important, etc. So he's kind of relativizing this and saying what really happens is what he calls the entry of life into history. That is, the entry of phenomena peculiar to the life of the human species into the order of knowledge and power, into the sphere of political techniques. So what he means by that is that life up to that point, up to the late 18th and especially the 19th century, life as sort of the biological process and the biological reality of human beings is outside history. So society does not have the means yet, up to this point, to change what we actually are as living beings. So society changes all kinds of things, but it doesn't change the actual biology, and this is now changing. And this is what he means by the entry of life into history. So life becomes a historical phenomenon, whereas previously it had been sort of extra-historical. So the biology changed only at an extremely slow kind of pace, which is what he means by outside history. So it enters history and it adopts the pace of human history, which is much, much, much faster. So the history as dominated by knowledge and power and as characterized by political techniques. So life itself becomes a subject of politics. That is the basic thing he's getting at. Now he's kind of relativizing this in the next few sentences, and he's saying that obviously epidemics and famines had always existed as phenomena that sort of bridge life and politics and society, so they were not totally separate and so on. But he says, but through a circular process, the economic and primarily agricultural development of the 18th century and an increase in productivity and resources, even more rapid than the demographic growth it encouraged, allowed a measure of relief from these profound threats. So basically, modern science, the development of our productive forces based on science, first of all in agriculture, sort of diminished epidemics and famines. So they become less regular and also less grave, although they don't go away entirely. But and he says here, the period of great ravages from starvation and plague had come to a close before the French Revolution. Death was ceasing to torment life so directly. So before the last third of the 18th century, which is our kind of transition period into what for Foucault is modernity, before that, death was a constant and all-encompassing threat that threatened human societies. And from now on, it is much less so, although we are obviously witnessing, and we know very well that it hasn't gone away, but it is much less regularly the case that death is tormenting our lives. So we kind of have through science, we have kind of a handle on death. But at the same time, the development of the different fields of knowledge concerned life, etc., a relative control over life averted some of the imminent risks of death. Methods of power and knowledge assumed responsibility for the life process and undertook to control and modify them, etc. So this is all describing how we get a increasingly strong grip on these processes. For the first time in history, no doubt, biological existence was reflected in political existence. That means that the political existence increasingly is concerned with safeguarding and managing the life processes themselves. The fact of living was no longer an inaccessible substrate, so kind of a presupposition, something that is before, that happens before an outside society, and that only from time to time kind of crosses the border into the political, but rather it becomes directly the object of society and politics themselves. So society is taking charge of life and gave power its access even to the body. So power, that means the sovereign power of the state or the ruler, but really we are now increasingly talking about the state, not anymore individual rulers, gain the power to access actually the body. So the actual bodies are now managed by the state. This he refers to as biohistory, which is the history of biopower and so on, which made knowledge power an agent of transformation of human life. It is not that life has been totally integrated into techniques that govern and administer it. It constantly escapes them. So again, he relativizes this a little bit. This is only a tendency, so it's not a total transformation. Outside the Western world, famine exists on a greater scale than ever. So these are the limits of this of modernity, basically. And the biological risks are perhaps greater and perhaps more serious than before the birth of microbiology. So we are at the same time producing risks, he's saying here. For millennia, man has remained what he was in the classical period, etc. Basically just an animal with added capacity for political, societal existence. Modern man is an animal whose politics places his existence as a living being in question. So again, that refers to the occurrence of genocides. Obviously, he mentioned the Holocaust, the nuclear Holocaust, if you like, that he mentioned before, and now we could add perhaps genetics as a technique that changes the actual biological structure of life, and might perhaps also encompass the possibility of endangering life as such. That is what he's sort of hinting at here. This creates a new mode of relation between history and life. So life is not anymore outside history, but it has moved inside the realm of human historicity. Human historicity means that everything we produce as humans, society basically, is historical. So it changes in history, and it changes quite rapidly. So if you certainly compared to the normal historical change that takes place outside human society. So obviously also the non-human nature changes, but it changes much, much, much more slowly. So basically it is almost not changing. That's what he's saying. And now the biological life of humans, what we biologically are, moves into this sphere of accelerated change, which is the sphere of human historicity. Now in the next section, or in the next paragraph, he introduces another pair of concepts, namely that of norm and law, which he opposes to each other, whereby norm is the more modern and law is the more old-fashioned expression of sovereign power. Now he talks about the growing importance assumed by the action of norms at the expense of the law. So law is always armed. It is linked to the old idea of sovereignty, which is the power of threatening death to those who transgress the rules, the laws. The law always refers to the sword being the symbol of the law. So the law is always connected to the ability to take life. And this is of course still the case. But something has shifted. A power whose task it is now to take charge of life needs continuous regulatory and corrective mechanisms. So you don't want to kill everybody who transgresses some kind of rule or law. You want to regulate and correct them so they don't transgress. That is the nature of modern power. And that has to do with norms, much more than with laws. So norms are the formulated expectations of how you should behave, and once you have internalized these norms, then this is how you behave. So no need to punish, let alone kill anyone. That's basically the shift. What norms do, it distributes the living in the domain of value and utility. So I suspect value and utility, these concepts are here used in the sense roughly as we know them from classical political economy. So what society does, of course, it distributes the living human beings, the workers basically, workers and managers and everybody else. They have to be distributed in society, which is, in modernity, the domain of value and utility. So we have to make ourselves useful in some form, otherwise we're not going to get paid. So that's obviously the I think in the background here. It affects distributions around the norm. So there is a kind of a norm how bodies should be distributed in the realm of society, and power basically leads these bodies to allocating themselves in the places that the norm attributes to them, that are given to these bodies. Now again, like previously, he's relativizing this a little bit again and saying, I'm not saying that the law just fades away, so that's obviously not the case. We have plenty of laws, but law also operates more and more as a norm. So a law is also a mechanism that can be used in a normative way. So if there is a law, then this creates a norm. So basically, I think what he's trying to say is that modern law is much more a form of norm than it is actually a law that simply commands punishment if you transgress the law. So the function of the law is to create in the individuals the understanding that there is a norm, there is an expectation how and what you're expected to do. And so you do it. So you don't run into trouble with the law. So the law is itself sort of regulating and disciplining, if you like. And obviously he also grants that there's an awful lot of discussion in modernity, especially in the 19th century, about constitutions and legal frameworks, etc. But actually they are much less important than the creation and establishment of norms in society. And then he adds that the great struggles, so basically social struggles in the modern period, were not so much so they also changed their character. So maybe he says here in the older periods, such struggles aspire to the coming of the emperor of the poor, some kind of messiah-like sovereign that would sort out things, etc. But that is not anymore the case. So what happens in the modern context is rather that demands are being made that relate to life itself, that demands are made that relate to basic needs, to man's concrete essence, the realization of his potential, a plenitude of the possible. So these are the kind of demands that modern social movements are making. And he summarizes this here. Life as a political object was in a sense taken at face value and turned back against the system that was bent on controlling it. It was life more than the law that became the issue of political struggles, even if the latter were formulated through affirmations concerning rights. Affirmations meaning, in this case, sort of demands, basically. So the right to life, to one's body, to health, to happiness, to the satisfaction of needs, and beyond all the oppressions or alienations, the right to rediscover what one is and all that one can be, this right, which wouldn't have made sense in the classical juridical system. So these are typically modern rights or ideas, modern ideas of right. This was the political response to all these new procedures of power, which did not derive either from the traditional right of sovereignty. So basically what he's saying is that movements in modernity, so since the French Revolution, talk about rights, but what they actually mean are rights to life, so rights to the actual concrete material necessities, rather than sort of more abstract, old-fashioned rights of sovereignty. Like I think here of the right of the freeborn Englishman, this kind of thing. That is very much old school. New school is rights concerned with birth control. That would be an issue that is very much in the center of the new type of regulating and disciplining society that Foucault is talking about. So I'm making a break here. This is the first section of the text, the first 10 pages, and then I will deal with the rest in a second video in an instant. Thank you very much for your attention so far, and I'll stop the recording at this point for part 1 of chapter 5 of Foucault's The History of Sexuality, Volume 1. Thank you.